Okay. Welcome to Savvy Sab's podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest today is journalist and author Whitney Webb, who is also the most requested guest for Savvy Sab's podcast. Whitney, I'm so delighted to talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You have been the most requested guest for this show. A number of people have reached out to me and said, please get Whitney Webb on, especially when I was talking about Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of people said
hmm
to bring you on. So I'm so glad to talk to you. And I do want to start off diving into the 2024 presidential election. Obviously, this time around, there is a huge elephant in the room, and that is Israel. And this is all around October 7th and the genocide that is taking place
hmm
in Gaza. I think for the first time since hosting this show, I'm seeing a lot of people pay more attention to what Israel is as the creation of Israel, the treatment of Palestinians, but also people are starting to pay attention to politicians' connection to the Israeli lobby. And they're starting to see that both Republicans and Democrats have that connection. Recently, Kamala Harris stated that she approves of a ceasefire. There was a conversation that she had privately with some of the uncommitted supporters where she told them that she would be open to an arms embargo. But publicly, her campaign has said that she would not support an arms embargo. And I want to get your take on this about this hold that these organizations like AIPAC and also J Street have on these politicians, and how likely do you think it is that someone like Kamala Harris will actually support an arms embargo if she is elected?
Yeah, so I think it's very unlikely that Kamala will actually support that once in office. I think people need to keep in mind, regardless of what party you're listening to, that campaign promises or sales pitches, and we have so many examples of people running for president saying one thing on the campaign trail and doing, essentially the exact opposite once they get in office. And so Kamala, is someone who's been in the office of vice president, and we kind of know what her stance is, and we've seen what the Biden administration has done in relation to what's transpired in Gaza. And obviously, she hasn't put any pressure on them at all as vice president, and she easily could have. And I think, again, it's just a way of trying to differentiate herself in terms of rhetoric from Trump. But I think in terms of practice and how it would pan out with her in the White House versus Trump in the White House, I think the difference is, as it relates to U.S. support for, the Israeli war machine would essentially be unchanged. And I think that's pretty clear if you look at just the DNC and the Republicans historically in their relationship with Israel, and, essentially letting Israel dictate major aspects of U.S. foreign policy, specifically as it relates to the Middle East. And being one of the driving forces behind a lot of efforts of the U.S. to enact regime change in the Middle East, as well as being one of the main, again, driving forces behind the invasion of Iraq after in the post 9/11 era and all of that. A lot of that was drawn up in documents created by U.S. neocons that served in the Bush administration for Netanyahu. This policy document called A Clean Break, which essentially laid the groundwork for what would become the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then later on the dirty war in Syria. And a lot of these people, neocons have sort of rebranded. Richard Pearl, for example, had a close relationship at one point with Peter Thiel and helped him set up Palantir, which is a company that has ties to the Biden administration as well as to the Trump campaign. Avril Haines, the top intelligence official in the Biden administration, is used to be a very high-ranking consultant and longtime consultant for Palantir, for example. As far as AIPAC goes as an organization, what a lot of people don't know is that they've also been caught being involved in espionage operations, even though they weren't charged for it formally. I forget the exact nature of what happened, but it was reported on pretty early on, I think, by Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com back when it was happening. And it was, I think, a guy at the Pentagon was passing classified information to officials at AIPAC, who then passed it on to the Israeli government. And the case was essentially shut down and very poorly handled, and pretty much everyone involved should have gone to prison. And there was also an espionage scandal involving AIPAC in the 1980s. And AIPAC is funded, a lot of it is funded by this group of Zionist billionaires, or historically has been, that are loosely known as the Mega Group, which is sort of the nickname that the Wall Street Journal gave them. Back in the late 90s, but this was created in 1991 by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman, and so intimately involves Wexner, the Bronfman family, the Crowns, who were actually a major force behind Obama's political career. And, a lot of, these other figures that have had an outsized role in donating to AIPAC. And Wexner in particular has a lot of influence on AIPAC as well. I think one of the top people at AIPAC, a couple of years ago, essentially bragged that most of the top people in the organization had previously, been Wexner fellows. So, undergone sort of like the Wexner philanthropic leadership training courses and all of that. And so a lot of these billionaires, as I wrote in my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, have historic ties to organized crime, specifically the Crowns, the Bronfmans, and Leslie Wexner himself. And so, they've tried to sort of dominate a lot of U.S. foreign policy decisions as it relates to Israel, and have, questionable interests. And a lot of their organized crime ties, I think, are very important, because if you look at the creation of the state of Israel, particularly its national security state in the late 40s, it involved a significant amount of organized crime figures in the United States who were trafficking weapons to the Haganah, which is the precursor to the IDF. And so once the Haganah transformed into the IDF, and a lot of these other groups became, that were, paramilitary groups before the creation of the state of Israel, they had all these ties to, essentially what was the Jewish mob in the United States, and those ties persisted. And that particular network of organized crime, it is directly tied to these billionaires I just mentioned. And so, I think that helps sort of flesh out why this relationship is that way, and also helps explain why you have so many collaborations over the years between CIA and Mossad. And so, I argued in some past work at when I worked at Mint Press News that really what we have at this point is a binational security state, because of the lot of policies that have been made. But it really goes back to this nexus at the end of the end of the 1940s, when organized crime sort of got really involved, not just with U.S. intelligence, but also in the creation of Israel's national security state as well. And so AIPAC is sort of a lobby group for a lot of those interests, unfortunately. And also, there's a lot of, I would argue there's some other interests here as well. So like Gaza, for instance, is being used. And historically, Palestine has been used by the Israeli war industry for the purpose of testing weapons of war. And now you have some of these AI defense companies, or other, companies that are trying to transition into AI, like Palantir, teaming up with the IDF to essentially run live trials on, their AI powered death machines on civilians in Gaza. And it seems very unlikely, because of the ties of the people that create those organizations, or that fund them. They have ties to really both parties here, whether it's Trump or or the Republicans or the Democrats. So unfortunately, these companies are obviously kind of interested in advancing their I guess bottom line and their products, but it's being tested in absolutely the worst way possible. And I've never heard any politician even reference that fact, or the fact that these AI weapons have been proven to be grossly inaccurate, or are being used to target, entire families in the Gaza Strip on very, basically on metrics that nobody knows. A lot of these AI programs that have been used in the war on Gaza are completely opaque, and no one really knows how there's, the kill lists they're drawing up are being developed. So unfortunately, a lot of that's being done with U.S. Silicon Valley, with U.S. intelligence, and with U.S. military contractors. And, those are the people that have an outsized influence on the country. And I think it's very unlikely that Republicans and Democrats will go against that, especially if AIPAC is successful in, buying their silence, which there's major political contributions that AIPAC makes, which, of course, facilitates a lot of these policies at the congressional level as well.
Journalist Rick Sterling, I interviewed him a while back, and he was explaining to me that JFK wanted to have, back then it wasn't APAC, there was a different name for it, but similar idea. He wanted that organization to register as a foreign agent. And he
Yeah,
also
it
apparently,
was him and RFK, who was his attorney general, tried really hard to get, I forget the name, but yeah, it was a precursor to, it might have been the Zionist Organization of America, actually, ZOA, which is still around. And Morton Klein runs it, and he's very close to Trump world, I guess.
right, right. And so
Mm.
obviously that didn't happen. JFK was assassinated.
Hmm.
So we didn't see that come to light. What is the likelihood, considering all these protests that have happened all across the world for the Palestinian cause? There have been thousands of people out in the street. There's thousands of people in the street yesterday in Chicago protesting the DNC convention, pushing Kamala and Biden to move in a different way on this particular issue. The big demand has moved from a ceasefire to an arms embargo with Israel. What is the likelihood, and please be just 100% candid, because I really want my viewers to not waste their time and think that they are going to be able to push someone in a different direction, push a politician in a different direction. What is the likelihood that today, given everything that has happened and the numerous protests, that our government will move away from the state of Israel or cut ties with Israel or cut ties with organizations like APAC?
Yeah, I think it's hugely unlikely, at least in the short to medium term. And there would have to be some major structural change in the US political system, I think, for that relationship to be broken. And there's a couple of reasons I say this, but one reason that's sort of overlooked that I reported on a lot when I worked for Mint Press News is that there's a particular billionaire who's very close to the Zionist fold, who's forgetting his first name, but his last name is Singer. And he created this organization called Startup Nation Central with a bunch of people with connections to the Israeli government. And basically his goal there was to have these Israeli intelligence connected startups promoted, and specifically to U.S. companies to facilitate their mergers with U.S. companies as a way to have Israeli intelligence veterans in key positions in the U.S. tech industry to prevent any sort of meaningful embrace of the boycott, divest, sanctions movement or BDS movement against Israel. And this was back in like 2012. So this has been something that they've been concerned about potentially happening, I would argue, for a long time. And there's been extreme efforts to sort of yoke together the infrastructure of the military and also the national security state of the U.S. To, infrastructure service providers or software developers that are from, Israeli intelligence. And some of these are quite disconcerting. So in 2019, one of these companies that's a contractor to the U.S. military is a cybersecurity firm called Cybereason. And Cybereason did all of these very weird simulations with U.S. law enforcement about a hack disrupting a U.S. presidential election and what would be needed to have the election canceled and martial law declared in the country. And this particular company was created by Israeli intelligence veterans, one of whom, the head of it, overtly says that his work at Cybereason is a continuation of his work at Israel's Unit 8200, which is essentially like the Israeli NSA equivalent, signals intelligence. And they contract for major aspects of U.S. military infrastructure now. So, when you are a cybersecurity company, you also get a lot of access to the most essential systems that you're ostensibly trying to protect. But this is, a foreign intelligence and foreign military, using its veterans and sort of embedding them in major aspects of U.S., national security infrastructure, which is a huge U.S. national security risk, but it never gets talked about. And, again, I would go back to the argument that the intention for decades has been to build a binational security state to prevent the U.S. separating itself from Israel in any meaningful way. And I think that's also true of some other countries as well, like the U.K., for example. And I think that's why you had Netanyahu a few years ago in referring to the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which is really most of the English-speaking world, saying that Israel is really the second eye of the Five Eyes, and that it, essentially dominates a lot of this infrastructure, cybersecurity infrastructure for these countries as well. And Netanyahu in 2012 oversaw the under his administration back then, oversaw the development of this cybersecurity, I guess you could say, intelligence policy, where a lot of operations that used to be done in-house in Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies were going to be spun off into private cybersecurity companies. So essentially admitting that the policy was to use the Israeli cybersecurity tech industry and also other aspects of the tech industry as fronts for Israeli intelligence. It's like an admitted policy they've had since 2012. I think it's very unlikely that because of how extensive the connection of U.S. critical infrastructure is to Israel or companies tied to Israel, it would be very hard for any meaningful separation to take place. And I don't just mean that in terms of military. You may remember, a year or two ago, maybe it was a little more recent, there was some sort of hack on some water system. I forget what state it was, but there was a lot of fear mongering about that, about hackers. And that particular, water system or dam or whatever it was controlled by an Israeli company or managed by an Israeli company. And, I guess some people argue that this is fine because Israel is, supposedly the US's greatest ally. But that's not necessarily true. There's Netanyahu, for example, pushing for the invasion of Iraq, for example, that was not really in the US's best interest in terms of a national security perspective, along with the war on terror. And really, the neocons in the US were pushing it through, but conservatism basically seeks to align US and Israeli foreign policy goals, basically conflating Israeli policy goals with U.S. policy goals. That obviously complicates things, even more. And so there's this very extensive relationship that a lot of people, I think, don't really understand. And it was intentionally set up this way, I think, to prevent the voice of the people from being heard.
I totally hear where you're coming from. And thank you so much for saying that, because I don't think I'm seeing a lot of people believe the rhetoric that Kamala Harris is saying. And I don't think people really understand just how deep this goes. And that brings me to Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, because when it was announced by Donald Trump that he was choosing J.D. Vance, a lot of people, even some conservatives, were not happy about that pick. It made sense that Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz if she's trying to win over some of the progressive base. So that made sense. But the J.D. Vance pick was kind of odd. He seems like he's kind of a wild card. He says some things that are just really weird, like saying that people should be punished for not having children, for example. But I'm curious to hear from you. There have been reports that J.D. Vance has some type of connection between with himself and Peter Thiel, and that may have something to do with why Donald Trump made that pick. And I want people to hear about this too, because I'm hearing people say, well, Donald Trump is going to be, anti-war, and that he didn't start any wars, but he implemented coups in Venezuela, et cetera. And people want to forget all those things. I just want people to realize how far the corruption goes on both sides. What is that connection there between J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel?
Yeah, so J.D. Vance, as we know him today, wouldn't really exist without Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel started his venture capital career, bringing him on to Mithril Capital, which is one of these VC firms that Peter Thiel has created, and then also financed his entire political campaign. Not entirely, but made the biggest donation to a Senate campaign in U.S. history to J.D. Vance to get him elected to the Senate. And also was a major donor to start up J.D. Vance's own venture capital firm, which is called Narya Capital. And it's funny because another person who donated a lot of money to J.D. Vance's venture capital firm is Eric Schmidt, who's actually a big Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden donor that is the former head of Google, and also the person that ran the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. So basically the person that charted out the CIA and military's AI policy, and has had an outsized role on science and tech policy in the Biden administration. So it just kind of goes to show you that, these kind of elections, I would argue, are sort of like, are we choosing for Eric Schmidt or Peter Thiel, Democrats or Republicans? Because Silicon Valley oligarchs really dominate both parties, but they ultimately agree on a lot more than they don't. So you have, for example, Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel coming together in backing JD Vance's own VC firm, but they're also together on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Conference, which is sort of this closed door conference of elites that's quite controversial and even more secretive than things like the World Economic Forum's annual meeting and things like that. At least that's filmed and the public can watch it. Bilderberg is not quite that, but you'll have top intelligence figures, top government officials, and top people from, the corporate sector coming together to essentially collude about their agendas for the world going forward. So again, Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt tend to agree on a lot more than they don't. But they back politicians that have different rhetoric, but ultimately implement the same policies at the end of the day, which is, why we have this uniparty phenomenon that people over the past several years have been able to see. But, it seems like whenever there is an election year and a lot of election related content is out, people that knew about the uniparty seem to kind of forget that it's a thing and think that there are meaningful differences between the two parties. So as far as JD Vance goes, the ties to Peter Thiel are very important. He owes his political career to Peter Thiel, and he owes his very successful venture capital career to Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel is a problematic individual. He frames himself as a libertarian, but if you actually look at what he says about economics and his beliefs there, he's really much more of a fascist. His view is that free market competition is bad, that monopolies are good. And in his practice, when he set out to make these, de facto monopolies, which he did with PayPal and then Palantir, he built those monopolies with U.S. intelligence, like from the very beginning. With Palantir, it's very overt, but it's also been admitted as it relates to the origins of PayPal as well, that they were consulting every 3 and 4 letter agency in the United States as they were beginning to set up their company. So that to me is not a free market libertarian at all. That's someone who's a cartel market libertarian. And so he and some of the people in his network, I guess, which I sort of nicknamed the Thielverse, they basically adopt a lot of this so-called America First rhetoric, but in practice, they're just as bad as the other side, and support a lot of the same policies and the same wars. And things like that. But, aside from PayPal, one of the things that is most concerning about Peter Thiel is his involvement in Palantir. I mentioned earlier he had connections to Richard Pearl. He used Richard Pearl while he was setting up Palantir to connect him with the person that was running a surveillance program that was at that time being defunded by Congress that was called Total Information Awareness and was supposed to be housed in DARPA. And it was one of these, it was even more invasive into Americans' lives than the Patriot Act even was. And that's why it was defunded and the Patriot Act was not. And essentially what Peter Thiel did was turn Palantir into a completely privatized version of Total Information Awareness, because they correctly gambled that people had complained about the military having this program because it was housed in DARPA, which is part of the Pentagon. But if it was just a private sector venture, people wouldn't complain as much. And they were completely accurate about that. And so Peter Thiel not only privatized that failed DARPA program as Palantir, he also privatized another DARPA program that was shut down, but part of the same circle of surveillance, projects and proposed projects, and turned that into what is now Facebook. So Facebook existed before Peter Thiel got involved, but the person that provided the capital that put them on a map and actually gave them, enabled them to rise the way they have was Peter Thiel, who was on the board for decades and essentially directed a lot of their product development and what they would become. And I wrote an entire article about the similarities and development of Facebook to be a resurrection of the same DARPA surveillance program, where we freely give away our faces and everything we do in our lives, our events, where we are, our location, posting it for other people to see, but also for the government to harvest that data, which was the intention of that original DARPA program. And Palantir, more specifically, what it does is that it analyzes all of the data mined off the internet about you. So everything, for example, the NSA would suck up about your activity. Palantir turns all, this massive swath of otherwise unusable data, because it's just so much, and then turns that into actionable intelligence, like turns it into something that intelligence agencies can interpret. And one of the things it does is that it labels Americans subversive based on their online activity. And this is very bad, because the same group that made Total Information Awareness created this database during the Reagan administration that became part of the Iran-Contra scandal. And unfortunately, that database still exists. And so any American deemed subversive enough is put on this list. And as of 2008, there were 3 million Americans on it. And because of these protocols that were created in this Reagan era called the continuity of government protocols, if there's a vaguely defined national emergency deemed by the government to be severe enough, the people on this list can be detained or put under house arrest or whatever without any trial, just sort of have their constitutional rights suspended. So Palantir is the group that decides whether or not you're on that list. And they're a contractor for all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, and also for our health system. They sucked up all the COVID data for both the United States and the United Kingdom, and are training their AI on that, and are basically, I would argue, trying to position themselves as building the an AI system to serve as essentially a global brain, because they run all the data for U.S. intelligence. They run all the data for the public healthcare system in the U.S. and the United Kingdom, or at least public health data, and major policies made by the CDC and HHS. And they also run Wall Street. A lot of major Wall Street banks and hedge funds and all of that use Palantir's AI to predict things before they happen, so they can make trades and things like that. So, this is a hugely influential company with arguably too much power. And it's pretty much a clear CIA front company, I would argue. I would say that because the first people to fund Palantir, besides Thiel, who gave some of his own money to it, was the CIA's venture capital firm In-Q-Tel. And for the first 5 or 6 years as a company, their only client was the CIA. Palantir CEO Alex Karp says the CIA was always the intended client of Palantir. And I think in just a 3-year period, early on in the company, the top engineers at Palantir visited CIA headquarters in Virginia over 200 times. Having the CIA tweaking to help them develop their product. So that's a very, very extensive relationship with the CIA. And to claim that, someone like Peter Thiel is a libertarian, that would, presumably libertarians are about limiting big government and the excesses of big government. And this is a guy that gave literally the most out of control surveillance tool to the most out of control intelligence agency in the United States and arguably the world. So, this is not a guy that I think is good at all. The fact that his, a guy that he essentially created is Trump's vice presidential candidate, I think should be really concerning. For those reasons alone. But also, Thiel, back when Trump was in office the first time, was also a big part of Trump's transition team, picked major aspects, or helped make major appointments on who was brought in at the Trump Pentagon, for example. And with J.D. Vance as the VP, arguably his influence will be even greater than it was last time around, without Thiel even having to be openly donating to the Trump campaign. And Thiel isn't, as far as we know, but a lot of people deeply connected to Peter Thiel are, like Palmer Luckey, who runs Anduril, which is Thiel funded, and Palmer Luckey is a Thiel fellow. And Anduril develops all these autonomous drones for Ukraine. And I believe that they've partnered with Israel and the IDF, and they also, of course, develop it for, the U.S. military. And they're building the virtual border wall with facial recognition technology on the U.S.-Mexico border, which is what Trump has promoted as the new, instead of a physical wall on the U.S.-Mexico border that he campaigned on previously. Now he is all about the smart wall, which Palmer Luckey happens to be building. So we can assume that those contracts will increase under a future Trump administration. But unfortunately, it's also something very supported by Democrats as well. Actually, when Trump came out and said, "Oh, I'm going to build a physical barrier on the U.S.-Mexico border," and Democrats complained about that, their response, the policy they gave in response was build a smart wall, which is not what Trump is doing. So, this is something that will advance regardless of who's in office, unfortunately. And so a lot of these, same Silicon Valley guys, again, whether it's Peter Thiel or Elon Musk or the PayPal mafia guys, I guess, because David Sachs is also backing Trump, they have their particular rhetoric. We're anti-woke and all of this stuff. We're America first. And then you have Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt and all of these guys, Bahir Omidyar, who owns PayPal, on the Democrat side. But at the end of the day, they agree about programmable surveillable currency. They agree about digital ID, and biometric digital ID, and increased surveillance, and all of that stuff. At the end of the day, that just the metrics they use to sell it to their political base is different. So people are probably familiar with the left-leaning talking points in favor of those things. But as far as Trump goes, for example, he's pitching digital ID, facial recognition and biometric digital ID as a solution to voter fraud, which is a concern among the right-leaning base, and also illegal immigration. This is how we'll get illegal immigration under control, make everyone have a biometric digital ID, and implement biometric checkpoints at every port of entry of the U.S., so airports, the border, wherever. And again, this is something that's also supported by Democrats because, again, it's a uniparty, and the solutions that both parties suggest in the response to any sort of crises, whether real or manufactured, is either more control and more surveillance, or it's war. You get those are your two choices from either of these political parties that we have in the U.S.
That is incredibly concerning, Whitney. And I just want people to understand that these parties are very similar. And I feel like there's the separation on like the social issues, whether it's like for women's rights or, that type of thing. But when it comes down to the billionaire class, they both support the oligarchy. They both support the police state. These are types of things I've been trying to get people to understand. And essentially, everything that you just told me about Peter Thiel and JD Vance, what that says is that as much as Trump says he's going to go after the deep state, again, people have to realize that is just rhetoric, because he essentially has put the deep state as a part of his cabinet.
Yeah, and the Republicans traditionally frame themselves as the tough on crime party. And so because there's a lot of increased concern about security among his base, particularly on the border, they were framing the stuff on the border in like military terms. It's an invasion, all of that. I've argued that that's a way to manufacture consent for people to support military style solutions on the border or other ports of entry, and sort of get us in to sort of this techno-fascist system that was really built by the neocons back in the 80s and during the George W. Bush administration and the post 9/11 era. We have both parties, advancing those types of policies, unfortunately. So yes, it is definitely concerning. But I think it's important to remind people during an election year that, the powers that be agree on a lot more than they don't, and their policies harm everybody. And it's fine if you want to vote for any of these people, if you think one is the lesser of two evils, or will slow down the policy you hate the most more, or might do something to resolve a conflict or crisis that concerns you. But like you said, they're beholden to, the billionaires behind them, or, the club of billionaires in which they exist, because, at least one of the candidates running is a billionaire. Unfortunately, if you look at how things have been over the past 20 years in the US, every crisis, economic crisis in the US, has resulted in a massive wealth transfer for us to them. In 2008, we had Obama preside over that. His entire cabinet was essentially picked by Citigroup. And then you had another one during the COVID era, which Trump presided over. And, that essentially created the same situation. The economic response supposedly to COVID under Trump began several months before COVID was even declared a pandemic by the WHO. And it was arguably not about COVID at all. And it was this policy that was actually developed by BlackRock that they implemented called the Going Direct Plan. And in 2008, a lot of the bailout plans were also developed by BlackRock. So whether it's, left or right, you can rest assured that essentially Larry Fink is going to run the U.S. economy.
There you go. And then a lot of people assume that like Peter Thiel, because well, people are like, well, he started Rumble and they're allowing people to say what they want to say on Rumble. And I'm just kind of like, that doesn't mean he's still not trying to surveil people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we don't really know, do we, what Rumble does with user data. So maybe they can say whatever they want and they're not going to be censored. But that having someone that, the Palantir co-founder being behind it, and also someone like, Howard Lutnick being involved, who's the head of Counter Fitzgerald, who's now a co-chair of Trump's transition team, being involved. These are not good dudes. And especially in the case of Peter Thiel and Palantir, they data mine all these websites like Rumble and YouTube and whatever, and profile Americans based off of that data. So you're basically, Trump supporters, arguably right-leaning Constitution embracing Americans that own guns have always been the biggest target of the U.S. as it relates to this war on domestic terrorism that they've been developing for the past 20 years. And so I would argue that it's really a way to get them to say things that at a future point might be considered incriminating and sort of, profile people that they think may be a problem within that base at some point. And I think a lot of the efforts to get those particular people to back Trump is a way to sort of engineer their compliance, because if you can convince as far as the national security state goes, they've always been concerned about gun owners, and particularly like veterans, people with military training and guns that don't trust the state and don't trust the government, right? And so, if you can convince those people that their guys in the White House and that they have won, and that the guy in the White House is going to take out the quote unquote deep state and all of this stuff, then they'll be more compliant and more likely to acquiesce to policies they may not acquiesce to under a different type of administration. So I don't necessarily trust what's going on with Rumble at all. I think, it's positive in the sense that they don't censor videos to the extent that YouTube does. But as from the perspective of data mining and harvesting user data, this is something that is happening on all of the quote unquote free speech platforms, whether it's Rumble or Elon Musk's X. And it's important to keep in mind that Elon Musk is a military and intelligence contractor. He's deepened his ties with U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA. And those same agencies, particularly the Pentagon, have invested for the past 15 years or so, millions and millions of dollars in developing very sophisticated techniques of manipulating the public. Actually, one U.S. Air Force research proposal talked about researching how to use social media to turn people into drones, essentially, which is just like very disturbing when you think about it. If a Pentagon contractor runs a major social media site that has a bot problem, do you think he will prevent the Pentagon's bots or the Pentagon's social media manipulation techniques from operating on his site? It seems very unlikely because of the conflict of interest. So I would encourage people to keep that stuff in mind. And if you have Twitter and use it, if you haven't already, you should go in the settings and disable the little switch, because every account by default surrenders its user data to Elon Musk Grok AI. And so every tweet, every DM, everything you do on Twitter is being used to train his AI algorithm. So I don't really think it's about free speech for Elon personally.
That's right. That's right. And this brings me to Kamala Harris hiring two former BlackRock executives. So recently, for those who are not aware, Kamala Harris hired two former BlackRock executives to actually advise her economic platform. They had already worked with Biden as well. So it's not like these are people that she didn't know and wasn't aware of. But to the people who are saying that Kamala Harris is progressive and she's this communist, which obviously people don't know what communism actually means. These exaggerations are ridiculous. But this just goes to show you again, at the end of the day, you have to pay attention to what they do, not what they say, because BlackRock is an evil company. And I've talked about it on the show before many times. And the fact that she's willing to add two former BlackRock execs in, and she's developed this housing plan where she wants to give people $25,000 for a down payment if you're first generation or first time home buyer, and they're a part of the advising with this. This is the same company that bought foreclosed homes during the housing crisis, the '08 housing crisis. So people have to understand, like, they're not acting in good faith here. And what do you think that says about Kamala Harris, that she's willing to work with two former executives of BlackRock, of all people?
Yeah, so I mean, Kamala is very clearly part of the same DNC crowd that includes Biden, includes Obama, includes the Clintons. These kind of Democrat politicians who like frame themselves in terms of rhetoric as progressive, but in actuality, when you look at their policies, at best they're like center right. Like at best, you know? And so it's really no surprise that she would have BlackRock so intimately involved in developing her economic policy, because as I mentioned earlier, BlackRock is really a bipartisan economic advisor. So for example, Larry Fink used to manage Trump's personal fortune, and he was tapped specifically by Trump in the lead up to COVID to help develop the government's fiscal response to COVID. But really, it wasn't a fiscal response to COVID so much as a fiscal response to the U.S. government's lockdown policy, or rather the lockdown policies that were implemented in states but tacitly supported at the federal level. And again, in 2008, they helped organize the bailouts, which of course didn't really benefit Main Street. They benefited Wall Street. And the same was also true with the COVID policy and this whole idea of the going direct reset, which again is based on the research of John Titus, who published an article about going direct on the Solari Report, which is Catherine Austin Fitz's website. And for anyone interested in what is arguably the biggest wealth transfer from regular Americans to the oligarch class in American history, I would really encourage you to go and read his investigation. It's very eye-opening. So essentially what happened with going direct is that, previously there was this policy of quantitative easing, or rather, wanton money printing after the 2008 economic crisis that was going on, in the U.S. Federal Reserve System. And so BlackRock created this plan at the end of 2019 for the next crisis, that in the next crisis, the Federal Reserve should consider going direct. And so what that meant is that they would do the same money printing they did before, but instead of giving it to public sector entities, they would put it directly in the hands of Wall Street, like BlackRock. And then when the next downturn started, not necessarily when COVID started, but it actually started not long after like a month really after BlackRock made that proposal. The repo market in the US started to go totally haywire, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York started to intervene in that market and implement BlackRock's going direct policy. That continued from then all the way up until COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And then they just went into complete overdrive, printing all of this money and handing out to Wall Street. And then the BlackRock heavy involvement in what became the government's COVID fiscal policy, overseen by people like Mnuchin, for example, they were put in charge of a lot of these funding facilities that the federal government set up, supposedly to bail out Main Street from the lockdown policies. And instead of BlackRock using that money to help regular Americans, they bought shares in their own ETFs, and nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. And so this is a company that doesn't give a damn about the American people. All it cares about is creating profit for shareholders and the people whose money it manages, creating, greater profits for them, which in the past included Donald Trump himself and a lot of other, major oligarch figures that back Republicans, and they also back Democrats. Larry Fink himself, I think, is pretty overtly a Democrat supporter. But again, this is a company that's so powerful, and its connections to the U.S. government and U.S. government fiscal policy are so intertwined that you're going to see BlackRock involved in the next crisis to come, regardless of whether Kamala wins or Trump wins, because when Trump won, he called Larry Fink up and was like, Larry, develop a policy that, the government was actually already implementing before then, but just gave him free reign to go even crazier and steal all of our, hyperinflate the dollar and destroy regular Americans' purchasing power, and then give all this extra money that was printed directly in the hands of BlackRock. And so, a lot of the people now that blame all of the inflation on Biden, it was really Trump began that policy, but because of all the BlackRock people in the Biden administration, it was continued until the COVID fiscal response changed and they decided that COVID was over. And the BlackRock stuff is going to continue, like I said, regardless of who wins. And actually, there have been really prominent people from the U.S. political sphere that have pointed out that the next administration is very likely to grapple with some major U.S. government debt crisis. And so I think it's very safe to assume that whether it's Kamala or Trump in office, you're going to have BlackRock brought in to quote unquote solve the U.S. government debt crisis, because that's who Obama called on in 2008. That's who Trump called on during COVID. And, Kamala surrounded herself with BlackRock goons as far as her economic policy team is concerned. And, I think it's very unfortunate, but it's very telling. And it's also important to point out that BlackRock is trailblazing this whole idea of tokenizing real world assets. So basically, they're trying to make new forms of digital gold, kind of like, I guess, like Bitcoin's been called that, for example, but they're trying to basically tokenize major aspects of the natural world, which they say are like, this rainforest, this national park is of a finite supply, it's of a finite size. So we can tokenize each hectare or each acre of that and link it to like a token or something and trade it on the blockchain and make all of this money. That's basically, they're about to turn nature into a giant Wall Street casino, and it's going to be supported by Kamala or Trump because they framed it as, sustainable development. And this is going to stop climate change, but it's not. It's going to create an entire new asset class for Wall Street and allow their insane casino to keep going for the next 100 years plus.
Holy crap, Whitney. This is
BlackRock's terrible.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. And that's one of the companies I feel like a lot of people don't talk about. And even Bernie Sanders, when he called out the billionaires, he didn't call out Larry Fink.
Yeah, very few do. And there's, other groups that are in that same world of finance that are just as influential as BlackRock, like the Carlyle Group. And they have like very overt ties to the CIA. And no one talks about them either. And they own a bunch of this stuff, and Blackstone too. And you'll have a lot of these Wall Street guys and hedge fund guys. There's a bunch backing Trump, and there's a bunch backing Kamala. There's a bunch of Silicon oligarchs backing Trump, and there's a bunch backing Kamala. But ultimately, they agree, like I said earlier, on a lot of the same Orwellian and horrible policy choices that regular Americans are tired of, and we're being sort of divided and conquered by focusing on a lot of these rhetorical differences. And people have essentially developed amnesia, I guess you could say, about what these people did when they were in power and in office. What were their policy actions? So I think people should focus on what their policies have been when they've been in power and not so much on the rhetoric. Because, we know that with Trump and we know that with Kamala too. So another example with Trump is that he campaigned he was going to reinstate Glass-Steagall, which is the repeal of that happened during the Clinton administration, a Democrat, and largely created the 2008 economic crisis. And he claimed he was going to reinstate it. And then he gets in office and has all these a Goldman Sachs guy becomes his treasury secretary and all of this stuff. And it was Goldman Sachs guy, Robert Rubin, who repealed Glass-Steagall, and Glass-Steagall doesn't get reinstated. And instead, the banking industry gets even more deregulated under Trump. And that tends to be what happens more or less often with Democrats as well. Wall Street essentially always gets what it wants. And this particular faction of the Democrats, the Obama, Biden, Kamala crowd, and the Clintons, of course, are very, very, very cozy with Wall Street and have been historically. And the same is true for Trump, who was actually bailed out in the 1990s by Wall Street. And I believe it was actually Rothschild Inc. specifically, and the banker there that helped to bail him out, Wilbur Ross. Trump later made his commerce secretary. And when he was being bailed out, the head of that particular bank said that, we could have let Trump fail, like it wasn't really in our interest to bail him out, but the Trump name is still an asset. So that's why we bailed him out. like he's still useful because of the Trump name. So, I would argue that really both parties are always going to serve the billionaire class. And there's been a major effort to frame Trump as sort of a populist hero. And in order to do that this time around, there has to be a lot of amnesia about what he actually did when he was in office. And, most Americans have had 4 years to forget about everything he did. And now you have people that are sort of apologizing for stuff he did or saying he didn't do stuff he actually did in a way that reminds me a lot of how liberals were during Obama's reelection campaign in 2012, acting like the only reason, Obama didn't keep any of his campaign promises at all was because, it was these guys or this person or, the other party and all of that. And a lot of those same excuses are being rolled out for Trump right now. But you can't say that Trump is so amazing that he's going to destroy the deep state single-handedly and then say that he did all this bad stuff last time around because he couldn't control or rein in any of his executive appointees or cabinet officials. You can't have it both ways, unfortunately.
That's right. And that brings me to Jeffrey Epstein and Mossad, probably one of the most large cases that I have seen in the U.S. Or large cases of injustice was the Epstein trial. Especially when I did more research and I found that this was not the first time that they had, went to one of his homes. I believe they went to his home in Palm Beach years prior. There were people that chose to deal with Epstein even after knowing about the Palm Beach raid, including people like Noam Chomsky, for example. Yes. And this man was allowed to go on and continue doing what he was doing on this island in the Virgin Islands. The banks were all in on it. You have JP Morgan that was in on this as well. And it's crazy to me. It's shocking. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell went down, but to me, I felt like she was just the fall guy because at the end of the day,
absolutely.
Epstein, whatever, killed himself, whatever, in prison, whatever you want to call it. But Epstein is gone. Ghislaine Maxwell seems to be the fall guy. And also, we still have not seen the list of names, the clients that were purchasing those girls. And that has not been released. And those people are still walking among us. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people in that book are politicians.
Yeah, well, they're politicians and they're Silicon Valley oligarchs. Pretty much every Silicon Valley oligarch had some sort of major relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So the JP Morgan case that was brought against, JP Morgan by the U.S. Virgin Islands as it related to that bank's relationship with Epstein. The people that were subpoenaed included the two Google co-founders and Elon Musk. And I believe another Silicon Valley figure. It's also known that Reid Hoffman, who created LinkedIn and is a big part of the PayPal mafia and also a major backer of Kamala, arguably had one of the closest ties to Epstein in Silicon Valley. Peter Thiel was meeting with Epstein pretty regularly. So, some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley intimately involved with this guy. So I have kind of an unconventional conclusion about a lot of the stuff that ended up going down with Epstein. I think a lot of the focus on the coverage on sex trafficking distracts from the fact that Epstein, I think his main job wasn't sex blackmail and sex trafficking, though that obviously did occur. I think his main focus throughout the arc of his career, which really began in the 70s and then goes up until his arrest in 2019, was being a currency manipulator and a financial hitman, essentially, for intelligence agencies. So basically, shorting currencies, collapsing currencies, or bumping currencies up. He was part of a group of people that did that historically. The first instance we have of Epstein sort of hobnobbing with the elite is with a man named Jimmy Goldsmith, who was like a notorious currency speculator and currency trader. And that's why we have, for example, in 1995, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild now, wrote a letter to Bill Clinton when he was president in 95 saying she wanted to talk to him about Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization, why the Mexican peso was collapsing, which ultimately related and ended with things like Citigroup buying one of Mexico's biggest banks and all of this stuff. And Anyway, there's a lot to say there, but basically one of the people that shorted that peso and made a bunch of money was part of the same group that Goldsmith was a part of, a guy named Joe Lewis, who was also incidentally part of the FTX scandal more recently. So Jeffrey Epstein was when he was interviewed by prominent journalists for the New York Times and others, was frequently seen trading currencies and involved in Forex markets. He was very involved in Bear Stearns' efforts to digitalize Forex trading and all of that. Back in the 80s, after he was sort of forced out of Bear Stearns, he developed some sort of financial relationship with U.S. intelligence. And according to him, he was helping hide or helping find stolen money for powerful people, mostly billionaires. So if you're hiding and also finding stolen money for people, not only are you a financial criminal, but you have a very intimate understanding of the shadow banking system, of money laundering, and things like that. And also he was involved, it appears, with a significant amount of tax evasion and how to structure nonprofits as a way to sort of, you not really have them be framed as philanthropic organizations, but really they're like covert companies, which is why he was so involved in helping set up the Gates Foundation and helping set up the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative and all of this stuff. So I think a lot of efforts have been made to have the focus on Epstein just be on the sex crimes and not on all the other stuff he was doing, because if they were to focus on sort of the bigger picture, it would be very problematic for very, very powerful people on both sides of the political divide. And I do think it's absolutely true that there were efforts to use, sexual blackmail to manipulate powerful people or to buy them out or to secure their compliance with certain things. Because if you have compromised someone, you can control and influence them in unprecedented ways. And so something I pointed out in my book is that, sexual blackmail has been used by this network in which Epstein was part, for decades. And it goes back to the same thing I referenced earlier about sort of this merging of intelligence and organized crime back in the immediate post-World War II era, because traditionally sex blackmail and that kind of stuff and sex trafficking, all of that, that's what the mob did. Same with arms trafficking. These were mob rackets, and later the CIA, in the US at least, took over a lot of those rackets or helped run them in conjunction with these elements of organized crime, because a lot of these mobster guys later became key parts of CIA death squads and assassination teams and all of that stuff all over the world. So that's something that really has persisted throughout time. And so in this particular world, in this particular network in which Epstein swam, this type of behavior was actually not that uncommon. So for example, one of Epstein's clients in the 1980s was a very intelligence connected arms dealer named Adnan Khashoggi. And Adnan Khashoggi had a yacht, and he would sexually compromise and blackmail people there. Right. And another guy named Roy Cohn, who was very much tied up with the same, not necessarily with Epstein directly, but the same sort of like New York City based power networks that later Epstein became part of. Roy Cohn was also very involved in sexual blackmail with organized crime, and was pretty much overtly like a lawyer for major figures in organized crime, while also having a major foot in the Reagan administration, for example. And Roy Cohn was also the mentor to Donald Trump, and the place where Roy Cohn was very involved in that he and his associates in that used to blackmail people was later sold to Donald Trump, who had like questionable parties at the Plaza Hotel in New York in the early 90s, allegedly involving underage girls. Again, none of this has really been that investigated, but there is a lot of commonalities, and there's a lot of other sex blackmail scandals as well, like the Profumo affair that was sort of like a UK US sex blackmail scandal. There's just been a lot of these throughout, throughout history, but I guess it's just not something you're taught in school. So, for this particular network, again, that Epstein was inhabiting and the oligarchs he was, serving or fronting for, this kind of stuff actually happened perhaps more often than not. So again, I think the media coverage attempting to frame Epstein as an anomaly is very mistaken in this regard. And it actually goes on a lot more extensively than we've been led to believe. And I certainly think that a lot of the the people he was attempting to benefit as it related to blackmail. There's definite Israeli connections there. But again, I would argue that the network, and I argue in the book that the network that Epstein was really working for is sort of this CIA Mossad blob that grew out of sort of these parts of the CIA that were very teamed up with organized crime. They sort of splintered off and created a quote unquote private CIA in the 60s and 70s. And that core group later became really involved with the Reagan administration, became like sort of they became a lot of the main conspirators in Iran-Contra, for example, which is, something Epstein was allegedly involved in himself. As it relates to arms trafficking, Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, also involved in Iran-Contra arms trafficking. And Robert Maxwell, of course, was a major asset, if not an outright spy, for Israeli intelligence. And Epstein, according to people that worked with Maxwell during that time, said that Epstein was coming into the office and that they met Epstein because Robert Maxwell presented Epstein to them, saying that Epstein had been approved by Mossad higher ups. And there's other figures that have that were tied up with Epstein in some capacity that have come out and said that there was an Israeli intelligence affiliation with Epstein. And we also know that he had a very close relationship with Ehud Barak, for example, who's the former Israeli prime minister and also former defense minister, who during this period, when Maxwell and allegedly Epstein were involved in these Iran-Contra arms sales, he was head of the entire Israeli intelligence directorate. So he would have been one of those higher ups that would have approved Epstein during that period. And but well after that, when the sex trafficking and sex blackmail stuff was allegedly going on, the apartments where the trafficked girls are said to have been kept was frequented by Ehud Barak. He would sleep over there. He was seen coming in and out of Epstein's residence as well after the first arrest in 2007, and also got a bunch of money from the Wexner Foundation for undisclosed purposes when Epstein was intimately involved in the Wexner Foundation, and the Wexner Foundation cannot explain what it was for. There's all sorts of weird ties there. Also, the fact that Epstein put a lot of money into a company that Ehud Barak helped made, that's an Israeli intelligence firm that's now taking over the US 911 emergency call system called Carbine 911. And another major investor in that was Peter Thiel's Founders Fund. What do you know? So these networks, it's very important to follow the money. And I think in the case of Epstein, it's very important to follow the money as well. If people want to sort of get the deeper picture of it, I would recommend my book, One Nation Under Blackmail. It's 2 volumes. So the second volume deals specifically with Epstein and his life. But in order to sort of set the stage for the network that he was working for, I tell that network story in volume 1, going back to the 40s and sort of this union between organized crime and U.S. intelligence during World War II and how it deepened after that, the history of sex blackmail in the U.S. and a lot of these figures, Iran-Contra, including the Clintons' involvement in Iran-Contra and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think it really helps flesh out the idea that this is a bipartisan problem. This blob of organized crime and intelligence controls both parties. They're involved in all of these rackets that used to be the mob's rackets, whether it's arms trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking. This is all stuff we know the CIA does. They got it from the mob originally, and they do it in conjunction with these people. And also that a lot of these mob figures, including generational families that have been mob linked for a long time, are sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But a lot of these figures, I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
No worries. It happens.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to mention is that just to kind of sum this all up, I've been telling my audience that obviously the two-party system, which is, again, one uniparty, is not going to solve these issues. And I think a lot of people fall for this every election cycle, thinking that the person that they pick this time will be the one to do that. I've been advocating for people to organize locally within their communities, do mutual aid. These are the types of things that I do as well, and building dual power. And I feel like a lot of people they still are somewhat, I I don't want to say brainwashed, but just hopeful that the next politician this time around will be the one to save the day. And even when it comes to third parties, while I'll be supporting Jill Stein, I still tell people Jill Stein is not going to be your superhero. Like, you still have to do the work on the ground. You have to organize. How do
Mm-hmm.
you feel
Mm-hmm.
about that? And when we talk about like where a lot of the money comes from and the billionaire class and the control that these corporations have on these politicians?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you that the solutions that we need to look for are local. If people want to look or want to vote for somebody, that's your choice. And I'm not telling you what to do on election day, but unfortunately, Americans and a lot of other people in the world have sort of this nasty habit of thinking that all they need to do in terms of political activism, no matter how bad things are, is just vote once every 4 years and then go back to sleep. And I don't think that that is a winning approach at all. So you can vote for whoever you think is the lesser of two evils or whatever, which is what a lot of Americans have been doing for decades now, and expect a different result. But it seems very unlikely that it will result in anything different. And like you said, I think local organizing locally and building resilient local communities is really the only way forward, because the government is too corrupt and they're not going to come save you in the next crisis. Instead, during the next crisis, they will try and impose more surveillance and control over your lives and steal your money to transfer it to the oligarch class, which is what they've historically done every crisis we've ever had, ever, really. So as far as the Silicon Valley oligarchs, though, go, a lot of us are very dependent on their products. And if we don't want them to push us into this dystopian hellhole that they are building, that includes the ones that donate to Democrats and donate to Republicans, then we should try and divest from their services as much as possible and look for alternatives, or at least not be so dependent on their products. Because if we're dependent, they can just do anything they want to us, really. And I think there's going to be a lot of major efforts to sort of grab for control in unprecedented ways as it relates to technology or even internet access, and sort of like freedom of movement was denied to people during COVID, sort of deny people that if they don't get a biometric digital ID, or if they don't want to use a CBDC or a private sector equivalent, because a lot of people are concerned about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, because they're programmable and they're surveillable. But there's also private bank digital currencies that are being developed, especially stable coins, which is what Donald Trump has embraced. And even though he's against CBDCs, but he likes stable coins. But stable coins are also just as programmable and surveillable. And some of those stable coins, like Tether, for example, overtly partnered with the FBI and the Secret Service and have overtly stated that they're basically an extension of U.S. foreign policy abroad and the U.S. government. So these guys can program us and or program our money and surveil our money just as if it were a CBDC. So we're going to get that regardless of what party's in office, and Wall Street is all in for that. And that's why you've seen a lot of these guys come out and sort of promote this idea of, oh, we don't like CBDCs, but stable coins are okay. And it's freedom and whatever. I don't know. It's all very weird, but it's ultimately not that. Yeah, so there's a lot to that we can do locally to resist this, but it starts with building something with your neighbors and getting offline, at least some, because some of us have become really perpetually online, specifically in the COVID era and where we are now, because of lockdowns and whatever, and some people are still remote working or just got used to it. And I think the more offline we are, the better off we will be. So especially as we get closer to the election, I think the stuff we're going to get bombarded with in social media and the news cycle is going to be meant to break people's brains, get people really emotional, because when people are really emotional, they're easier to manipulate and they don't think critically. So the more offline you are, maybe you can look at headlines once in a while, but if you're like on Twitter more than like 5 hours a day, maybe you should think about getting back in the real world a little bit. and trying to, you know, build community with like-minded people that also want solutions to some of these problems. And if you have red lines, like you don't want to opt in to digital ID, you don't want to opt into programmable surveillable money, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to opt out? You probably will need other people to help back you up in those efforts. So it's really important to focus on the policy agendas that you're specifically either opposed to or support, and try and actualize as much as you can at the personal level, you know, how you're going to help advance that in your life or elsewhere. So maybe, like I said earlier, the US government can't meaningfully boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, but certainly us as consumers can divest and boycott Israel. And, you know, a lot of that can be done, whether it's for Israel, whether it's for Silicon Valley. You know, we have power. They spend a lot of effort convincing us we don't, and that the only way things can change is that we either get a billionaire or a billionaire puppet in the White House, or we start worshiping a tech billionaire as the savior of free speech in the United States. And that's really not where change is going to come from, especially when you consider that it's been a war between the billionaires and us for a very long time. And that war is kicking up into high speed. And those billionaires are teamed up with intelligence agencies and other groups that have unprecedented abilities to manipulate us psychologically and emotionally. And a lot of the ways they're manipulating us that way is on social media and on the online world. So the more we can sort of get a level, sort of keep a level head and all of that, I think a lot of it has to do with spending more time in the real world and not so much on their world, because the tech world, the online world as we know it today, is dominated by these guys.
Yep. All right. Whitney Webb, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me on.